The photo looked peaceful at first, showing two friends, but when looked at closely, the man's hand on her shoulder stood out. The afternoon light came through the tall windows of the Charleston Historical Society's restoration lab. It made golden squares on the old wooden floor. Dr. Emma Richardson fixed her magnifying lamp and took another photograph from the estate donation box. This one was in an ornate gilt frame. She carefully took off the protective tissue paper. It was a studio portrait from the 1850s. The photograph showed a well-dressed white man and a black woman standing formally in front of a painted backdrop of a country scene. They stood close, with the man's hand on the woman's shoulder. At first look, it seemed like a usual daguerreotype of the time. Wealthy people captured for the future. The man wore an expensive dark suit with a silk waistcoat. His hair was pomaded and neat. The woman next to him was striking. She wore a gown of fine taffeta with detailed lace trim. Her hair was styled in the popular ringlets of that period. The dress alone would have cost a lot of money, the type only rich people could buy. Yet something about the image bothered Emma's trained eye. She had studied thousands of 19th century photographs. This one felt off in ways she could not explain right away. She put the daguerreotype under the high-resolution scanner. This tool had shown many hidden details in historical images during her 15-year career. The machine made a soft hum as it captured every small detail of the silver-coated copper plate. Emma opened the digital file on her screen and started zooming in bit by bit. The man's face had a slight blur from movement, which was common in long exposures. The painted backdrop showed brushstrokes that the eye could not see normally. Then she got to the woman's face. Her expression stopped Emma suddenly. The woman's eyes looked straight at the camera with a strong intensity that crossed the years. Her mouth was set in a firm line, not quite a smile and not quite plain. But it was the tension in her jaw and the tightness around her eyes that told of something deeper than just the strain of staying still for a long exposure. Emma zoomed in on the man's hand resting on the woman's shoulder. His fingers pressed hard into the fabric of her dress. The pressure showed in how the expensive taffeta bunched a little under his grip. This was not the gentle, possessive touch of a husband. This was control. She leaned closer to the screen. Her heart beat faster. The woman's shoulder seemed a bit raised on that side, as if she tried to pull away from the touch but could not. The muscles in her neck showed strain, hard to see but clear once noticed. Emma sat back in her chair. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. She turned over the frame. Written in faded ink on a yellowed label were the words, Mr. Jonathan Hartwell and his wife, Charleston, 1857. His wife. Emma's fingers moved quickly across her keyboard. She opened the Historical Society's large database of Charleston families. The Hartwells were well known, one of the old plantation families with roots back to colonial times. Jonathan Hartwell, born in 1825, took over Riverside Plantation from his father in 1850. The property records showed over 300 acres of rice fields and a recorded enslaved population of 47 people in the 1850 census. She found his marriage record fast. Jonathan Hartwell married Catherine, no last name given, in a private ceremony in June 1856. No last name, no family listed, no church records of banns being posted, which was normal for white marriages in Charleston society. Emma opened newspaper archives from the Charleston Mercury and the Charleston Courier. She found several mentions of Jonathan Hartwell in the society pages: attendance at balls, membership in the Agricultural Association, purchases of new equipment for his plantation, but not one mention of his marriage, which should have been a big social event for a family like the Hartwells. The silence was loud. She started a new search for manumission records, legal papers proving that enslaved people had been freed. In the 1850s, South Carolina law said that any white man who married a black woman must first legally free her and get special permission from the legislature. The process was hard, costly, and socially damaging, but possible. There was no manumission record for anyone named Catherine connected to Jonathan Hartwell. No legislative petition for permission to marry across racial lines. No legal papers that would make this marriage valid under South Carolina law. Emma felt her hands shake as she reached for her phone. She called Dr. Marcus Webb, the Historical Society's senior researcher and an expert on antebellum Charleston. "Marcus, I need you to look at something right now." He arrived 20 minutes later, his reading glasses already on his nose. Emma had the photograph on her large monitor, zoomed in on the woman's face and the man's hand on her shoulder. Marcus studied the image quietly for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was serious. "This is not a marriage portrait. This is ownership put on record." He pulled up a chair and started typing, opening databases Emma did not even know about. In the 1850s, some plantation owners had what they called informal marriages with enslaved women. The women had no legal rights, no power to refuse, no protection under the law. But the men would dress them in costly clothes, give them better living spaces, and show them publicly as wives to explain the relationship, explain rape. Emma said softly. Marcus nodded with a grim look. The women were still enslaved, still property. The fancy dresses and studio portraits did not change that basic fact. And if the man grew tired of them, or if they tried to leave, they could be sold away from any children they had, beaten, or killed with no legal trouble. He zoomed in on the photograph even more, focusing on details Emma had missed. Around the woman's neck was a delicate gold chain, but at the base of her throat, barely visible under the high collar of her dress, was a thin line of scarring. "Collar marks," Marcus said. "From an iron collar worn long enough to leave lasting scars." Emma spent the next week looking for any trace of Catherine in the historical record. Enslaved people left few documents. They were not allowed to read or write in most southern states. Their births and deaths often went unrecorded, and their voices were kept quiet on purpose. But Emma had learned in her career that traces stayed if you knew where to search. She found the first clue in the plantation records of Riverside, kept in the South Carolina Historical Society archive. The inventory of enslaved people from 1855 listed Catherine, female, age about 22, house servant, purchased from the estate sale of Colonel Richard Thornton in September 1855. Purchased 6 months before the marriage. Emma traced back to the Thornton estate sale records. Colonel Richard Thornton had died suddenly in August 1855. His whole estate, including 23 enslaved people, was sold at auction to pay debts. The auction ad in the Charleston Mercury listed Catherine specifically, healthy female, age 22, trained in fine needlework and household management, excellent cook, literate despite the ban, no physical defects. Literate. Catherine could read and write, which was illegal for enslaved people in South Carolina, and very dangerous. Someone had taught her, probably in secret, at great risk. Emma's next find came from an unexpected place. A diary kept by Mary Simmons, a Charleston woman who wrote a lot about her social notes. The diary had been given to the Historical Society in the 1960s and partly copied. Entry from November 1856. Attended tea at Mrs. Patterson's house. Much talk about Jonathan Hartwell's strange arrangement. He has taken one of his servants as a wife and shows her off in silks and jewels as if she were a white woman. The creature is quite beautiful, I must say, but the boldness is shocking. Several ladies have stopped speaking to him in public. His mother is said to be ashamed. Entry from March 1857 saw Jonathan Hartwell and his wife at the market. She walked 2 steps behind him, her eyes looking down, wearing a dress that must have cost $200. When Mrs. Henderson bumped into her on purpose, she apologized a lot, though it was not her fault. One could see the fear in her eyes. How awful to be trapped in such a fancy cage. Emma found more entries over the following months. Mary Simmons, unlike most people of her time, seemed to see Catherine's humanity and her difficult situation. Entry from July 1857. I managed to speak briefly with the woman called Catherine at the dressmaker's shop. Mr. Hartwell had left her there while he did business. She has the most expressive eyes I have ever seen. When I asked if she was treated well, she said nothing, but her hands shook as she held her bag. I noticed bruises on her wrists, barely hidden by her gloves. Marcus helped Emma put together more of Catherine's background. Using the link to Colonel Thornton, they found that Catherine had been born on a small farm in the South Carolina upcountry around 1833. Emma tracked down the Thornton family papers at the University of South Carolina's special collections. Among the letters was one from Colonel Thornton to his sister dated 1848. My dear sister, you asked about the education of the servants' children. I admit I have let my late wife's unusual ideas influence me too much. She insisted that young Catherine be taught to read using the Bible, saying it would make her a better Christian. Now the girl is 15 and far too smart for her own good. She reads everything she can and asks questions that make the other servants uneasy. I fear I have made a problem I do not know how to fix. Catherine had been taught to read by Colonel Thornton's wife, a woman whose unusual views included the strong idea that enslaved people had souls worth teaching. When Mrs. Thornton died in 1852, Catherine lost her only protector. Emma found more letters, these from Colonel Thornton's business contacts. In 1854, he wrote to a slave trader in Charleston, "I have a house servant, female, age 21, who has become difficult. She is literate and has been teaching other slaves to read against my clear orders. She must be sold, but quietly. She would bring a good price for her skills and looks, but her education makes her risky." Before the sale could happen, Colonel Thornton died, and Catherine ended up at the auction where Jonathan Hartwell saw her and decided he wanted her. The daguerreotype took on new horror as Emma understood its real meaning. This was not a wedding portrait. It was a slave owner recording his purchase, dressing his property in expensive clothes to show his wealth and power. She found the photographer's records at the Charleston Museum. The portrait was taken at Bradford's photography studio in April 1857. The studio ledger listed the sitting Mr. J. Hartwell daguerreotype, full plate with female servant in formal dress. Special instructions, subject must appear as married couple. Payment $15 for female servant, not wife. The photographer had known exactly what this portrait meant. Emma learned that Bradford Studio specialized in what they quietly called peculiar portraits, photographs of white men with their enslaved mistresses dressed and posed to look like real marriages. It was a service offered quietly for clients willing to pay extra. Marcus found testimony from a formerly enslaved man named Samuel who had lived on Riverside Plantation. His story was collected by abolitionists in 1865. After the Civil War, Samuel's account was powerful. Mr. Hartwell bought Catherine from the auction and brought her to Riverside. He dressed her up like a fine lady and told everyone she was his wife, but we all knew the truth. At night, we could hear her crying in the big house. She tried to run away twice. The first time, Mr. Hartwell sent the patrollers after her. They brought her back and he whipped her himself, then locked her in the attic for a week. The second time, he told her if she ever tried again, he would sell her children south. She did not have children yet, but the threat was clear about what would happen if she did. Emma contacted Dr. Jennifer Marshall, a historian at Howard University, who specialized in the experiences of enslaved women in the antebellum South. They met by video call, and Emma shared everything she had found. Dr. Marshall listened carefully. Her face grew more serious as Emma went through the evidence. The photograph, the plantation records, Mary Simmons's diary entries, Samuel's testimony. "This is a clear example of sexual slavery hidden as marriage," Dr. Marshall said when Emma finished. White slave owners often said their relationships with enslaved women were agreed upon, even loving. They pointed to the expensive gifts, the better living conditions, the children they recognized. But consent cannot exist in a relationship where one person owns the other. She opened her own research files. "I have recorded over 200 similar cases from across the South. The pattern is the same. The man buys or inherits an enslaved woman, usually young and educated enough to be a companion as well as a sexual partner. He dresses her in fine clothes, gives her special treatment above other enslaved people, and sometimes even holds fake marriage ceremonies. But legally she stays his property. She cannot refuse his demands, cannot leave, cannot protect any children born from the relationship." "What happened to these women after the Civil War?" Emma asked. "It varied," Dr. Marshall said. "Some were freed when their owners died or when the Union Army came. Others were sold or left behind when the men lost interest or faced social pressure. Many died in slavery, leaving no records. The ones who survived often chose not to speak about their experiences. The pain was too deep to revisit." Dr. Marshall zoomed in on the photograph of Catherine. "Look at her hands. Notice how she is holding them. That is a protective pose. Fingers locked tightly, pressing against her stomach. In portrait study, we call that a comfort gesture. The subject is under great stress. Emma had seen it before, but Dr. Marshall was right. Catherine's hands were clasped so tightly that the knuckles looked pale even in the old daguerreotype. "The expensive dress is a cage," Dr. Marshall went on. "It marks her as her owner's property more clearly than chains would. Every person who saw her in those clothes knew exactly what she was, a slave playing dress-up at her master's command. The shame was part of the control." Emma felt ill. She had spent her career restoring and saving historical photographs, but she had never fully understood how photographs could be weapons, tools of control, recording wrongs under the appearance of respect. "What happened to Catherine?" Dr. Marshall asked. "Have you found any records after 1857? That became Emma's next job. She went back to the archives with new energy, searching through death records, slave lists, and estate papers. She found it in the Riverside Plantation records from 1859. Catherine, house servant, died in childbirth, February 15th. Infant also deceased. Total loss, $200. 26 years old, reduced to a dollar value in a ledger. Emma could not let Catherine's story stop there. She started looking into Jonathan Hartwell's life after 1859, hoping to find some justice, some result. Anything to show that Catherine's pain had mattered. What she found was a pattern instead. In the 1860 census, just 1 year after Catherine's death, Hartwell's slave list showed a new house servant, Amelia, female, age 19. Emma's stomach turned. She searched deeper into the plantation records, finding purchase receipts. Jonathan Hartwell had bought Amelia in March 1859, 1 month after Catherine died. She found another daguerreotype in the estate collection, dated 1861. The same photographer, the same studio, the same setup. Jonathan Hartwell stood beside a young black woman in an expensive gown, his hand on her shoulder. Amelia. The woman's expression was different from Catherine's, more accepting, more empty. Her eyes looked past the camera as if seeing something far away. The gold chain around her neck shone in the photographer's lights, and Emma could just make out the same faint scarring at the base of her throat. Marcus helped Emma trace Amelia's fate. She appeared in the plantation records until 1863, then disappeared. No death record, no sale record, just gone. "Probably sold," Marcus said quietly. By 1863, the war was going against the Confederacy. Plantations were being attacked. Enslaved people were escaping to Union lines. Hartwell might have sold her south before she could run, or she might have escaped and taken a new name. Emma found 3 more photographs over the next days, all from different estate collections in Charleston, all showing the same troubling pattern. 5 different women over 15 years, all bought by Jonathan Hartwell, all dressed in expensive clothes and posed as wives, all vanishing from the historical record after a few years. One of the later photographs from 1869 showed a woman named Sarah. This one was different, taken after the Civil War, after freedom, but South Carolina during Reconstruction was a risky place for black women, especially those forced into relationships with white men during slavery. Emma found an interview with Sarah, done by Freedmen's Bureau officials in 1871. The testimony was short but powerful. Question: You were formerly held in bondage by Mr. Jonathan Hartwell. Answer: Yes, sir. Question: And you lived in his house as his servant. Answer: He called me his wife, made me dress in fine clothes and pose for photographs, but I was never his wife. I was his slave. Question: You are now free. Why do you stay in Charleston? Answer: I have nowhere else to go. He gave me money when I left. Said it was because he cared for me, but it was guilt money. You cannot pay for what was taken from me. Emma knew she had uncovered something important, not just Catherine's story, but a wider pattern of abuse that had been hidden for over 160 years. The photographs saved as marriage portraits were really proof of ongoing sexual exploitation. She contacted the descendants of the Hartwell family who still lived in Charleston. The current generation had donated the photographs to the Historical Society years ago, unaware of their real meaning. Elizabeth Hartwell Morrison, Jonathan Hartwell's great-great-great-granddaughter, agreed to meet Emma at a coffee shop in downtown Charleston. She was a lawyer in her 50s with a careful way of someone who had grown up knowing her family's difficult history. "I knew my ancestor owned slaves," Elizabeth said, her hands around her coffee cup. "My family has been dealing with that legacy for generations, but I did not know about this." The photographs were always described as pictures of servants in their best clothes. No one ever said wives. Emma showed her the research, the plantation records, the purchase receipts, the testimony from Samuel and Sarah, the evidence of the pattern over 15 years. Elizabeth's face went pale as she looked at the documents. My God, he bought women like he was shopping for furniture. "The term historians use is fancy trade," Emma said softly. "Enslaved women who were sold especially for sexual purposes, often to wealthy white men who dressed them up and kept them as long-term mistresses. The practice was common, but rarely shown this clearly." Elizabeth looked at the photograph of Catherine for a long time. What was her full name? Did she have a family? "I do not know her full name. The records only list her as Catherine. Enslaved people's last names were not usually recorded, and if she had family, they would have been separated when she was sold." Emma paused. But she was literate. She could read and write. Someone cared enough to teach her despite the danger. Elizabeth took out her phone and started making notes. "This needs to be told. My family's foundation has been working on reconciliation projects related to slavery. This would be an important part of that work." "There is something else," Emma said. She showed Elizabeth the records of the 5 women forced into these false marriages with Jonathan Hartwell. Catherine was just one of many, and Jonathan Hartwell was not the only man who did this. I found similar photographs in collections across Charleston. This was a common practice, not something unusual. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "How many?" "I have identified over 30 photographs so far from the 1850s and 1860s alone, all showing wealthy white men posed with enslaved women dressed as wives. And those are just the ones that survived. There were probably hundreds more." Emma's research drew the attention of Dr. Angela Freeman, director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Dr. Freeman flew to Charleston to examine the photographs and documents herself. "This is outstanding work," Dr. Freeman said, studying the daguerreotype of Catherine under magnification. "These images have been hiding in plain sight in archives and family collections for over a century, wrongly labeled and misunderstood. You have given these women back their truth." She had brought a team of conservators and researchers. Together with Emma, they started a full review of Charleston area collections, looking for similar photographs. They found dozens. Each photograph told a similar story: wealthy white men, young black women in expensive dresses, studio settings meant to copy real marriage portraits. Once they knew what to look for, the signs of force became clear: the women's tight postures, the men's controlling grips, the lack of real happiness in the pictures. One of Dr. Freeman's researchers, a genealogist named Michael Chen, started tracing the women in the photographs through plantation records and post-emancipation documents. It was slow work, but slowly pieces of their lives came out. He found records for a woman named Rose, who appeared in an 1858 photograph like Catherine's. After freedom, Rose had filed a claim with the Freedmen's Bureau asking for payment for 15 years of forced concubinage. Her claim was turned down. The Bureau had no legal way to handle such cases. But her testimony lived on. "I was 15 when Mr. Davis bought me. He said I would live in the big house and have pretty dresses. I thought it meant I would be a lady's maid the first night I learned what he really wanted. I tried to resist, and he beat me. He said if I did not cooperate, he would sell my mother to a plantation in Mississippi. So, I stopped fighting. For 15 years, I wore silk dresses and smiled when white people looked at us. But at night, I prayed for death." Michael found another testimony from a woman named Hannah, recorded by abolitionists in 1863 when she escaped to Union lines in Florida. "Master bought me when I was 17 because I was pretty enough to show off. He made me pose for pictures with him, dressed me like a white woman, told people I was his wife, but I was not allowed to leave the plantation without him. I was not allowed to talk to other slaves without permission. If I displeased him, he would lock me in a room for days with no food. The other slaves hated me because I wore nice clothes and lived in the big house. They did not understand I was as much a prisoner as they were, just in a prettier cage. These testimonies gave meaning to the photographs that plantation records never could. The images showed beautiful dresses and formal poses, but the women's own words showed the violence, force, and pain those images hid. The National Museum of African American History and Culture announced a special exhibition called False Wives, Enslaved Women in the Photography of Possession. Emma's research formed the base, but it had grown to include over 60 photographs from collections across the South. The exhibition opened on a humid August evening in Washington, D.C. The gallery was full of historians, descendants, journalists, and members of the public. Emma stood near the entrance, watching people walk past the displays she had worked on for 6 months. The main piece was Catherine's photograph, made larger and lit dramatically, but now it was surrounded by context. The plantation records showing her purchase, Mary Simmons's diary entries describing her fear, Samuel's testimony about her attempts to escape, the death record reducing her to a dollar value. A panel next to the photograph explained the practice of sexual slavery disguised as marriage, with historical details about laws against interracial marriage, the complete power slave owners held over enslaved people, and the ways white supremacy excused terrible abuse. Most powerfully, the exhibition included the testimonies of the women themselves, Rose, Hannah, Sarah, and others, giving voice to experiences that had been quiet for over a century. Elizabeth Hartwell Morrison attended the opening, along with several other descendants of the men shown in the photographs. She had written a public statement admitting her ancestors' wrongs. Jonathan Hartwell used his wealth and power to exploit and abuse enslaved women for over 15 years. The photographs we kept as innocent family history were actually evidence of ongoing sexual violence. As his descendant, I cannot undo the harm he caused, but I can make sure these women's stories are finally told and their humanity recognized. Dr. Freeman gave the keynote address standing in front of Catherine's photograph. For too long we have cleaned up the history of slavery, reducing it to economic use while ignoring the sexual violence that was common in the system. These photographs force us to face an uncomfortable truth. Slavery was not just about labor. It was about total control, economic, physical, and sexual. She pointed to the gallery of images. Each of these women was somebody's daughter, somebody's sister. They had dreams, fears, talents, and potential. They were forced into these false marriages, dressed up and photographed to make their abuse seem acceptable. But look at their eyes. Look at their hands. Look at the tension in their bodies. They are telling us their truth if we are willing to see it. The exhibition became national news. Scholars started reviewing collections across the country, finding similar photographs that had been wrongly identified for generations. Descendants of enslaved women came forward with family stories passed down quietly, painful memories of ancestors forced into these situations. 3 months after the exhibition opened, Emma returned to Charleston. The Historical Society had made a permanent display based on her research, and they had ordered something special. In Hampton Park, on the grounds where Riverside Plantation once stood, the city had built a memorial. It was a simple bronze sculpture. A woman in an antebellum dress holding a book, her face lifted toward the sky. Her expression was dignified, strong, and defiant. The plaque read, "In memory of Catherine and all enslaved women forced into false marriages. Their silence was not consent. Their suffering was not love. Their story will not be forgotten." Below that, a longer inscription explained the history Emma had uncovered, naming Catherine and the other women whose photographs had been found, recognizing the trauma they endured, and honoring their humanity and resistance. Emma stood before the memorial as the late afternoon sun made long shadows across the grass. Beside her stood Margaret Wright, a woman in her 70s who had reached out to Emma after the exhibition opened. "My great-great-grandmother was named Catherine," Margaret said softly. "She was born enslaved in South Carolina, survived the war, and moved north during Reconstruction. She never talked about her time in bondage, but she kept one thing, a photograph of herself in a fancy dress. She showed it to my grandmother once and said, 'This is who they tried to make me be, but it was not who I was.'" Margaret pulled out her phone and showed Emma a photograph. It was Catherine, Clearly the same woman from the daguerreotype, but taken years later. She wore simple clothes, stood with her arms crossed, and looked straight at the camera with an expression of hard-won strength. She learned to read and write in slavery. Margaret continued. After freedom, she taught other formerly enslaved people. She helped start a school for black children. She lived to be 73 and died surrounded by her family. He tried to break her, but he failed. Emma felt tears running down her face. Thank you for sharing this, for showing me she survived, that she built a life after the horror. Yes, Margaret finished. The photograph you found shows what was done to her. This photograph shows who she really was. They stood together quietly, looking at the memorial. Other people started arriving. Descendants, historians, community members. Some left flowers at the base of the sculpture. Others stood quietly, paying respect to women whose names many of them would never know. Emma thought about how the original photograph had looked so peaceful at first glance. Just two people posed together. It had taken a closer look at the man's grip on her shoulder, at the tension in her body, at the context hidden in archives to see the truth. That is what history needed, the willingness to look closer, to question easy stories, to see what had been hidden on purpose. Catherine and the other women could not speak for themselves anymore, but their images remained, bearing witness. And now, finally, people were listening. Emma placed her hand on the memorial plaque, feeling the raised bronze letters under her fingers. "We see you now," she whispered. "We remember."